And now, for today, I'd like to have Mrs. Madonna Mascarello, who's a member of our board, introduce our guest speaker today. Good afternoon. When we booked this afternoon's speaker several months ago, we really had no idea that the topic of her talk would be an issue not just of concern to traditional Catholics, but to the wider population at large. You know, it may be only just in December 2018 that magazines like the Atlantic magazine are coming to notice that there's something amiss in the birds and the bees department. But the Catholic Church, can you hear me? Oh, okay. But the Catholic Church, who, in the words of Pope Paul VI, has always been an expert in humanity, has always been borne prophetic witness to the fact that if this or that social trend violates the human person, that there will definitely be problems that will be in the offing. The Church's demanding moral doctrine on sexuality and marriage has long been charged with putting a damper on the joy and spontaneity of free love. But study after study is revealing the deep and lasting damage that can be done when male-female relations are reduced to nothing more than hangouts, hookups, pornography, a swipe left or right on a Tinder app, or, God forbid, robots. It turns out that just as the Catholic Church has always said, when intimacy ceases to be an encounter with the fullness and dignity of another human person, within the lifelong commitment of marriage in order to the procreation of children, intimacy itself loses its charm. There are those, however, who are rediscovering the conventional wisdom of the ages, that interpersonal relations between a man and a woman actually have to be in person, that it takes time, effort, selflessness, and consideration to get to know another human being, and that mutual respect is always a good way to begin a relationship. Our speaker this afternoon has chronicled both the problem and some possible solutions. Catherine Fowler Sample began her career in film as a production executive at Mpower Pictures, which was founded by Steve McEveety, the award-winning producer of Braveheart and The Passion of the Christ. While doing independent research on what she calls the dating deficit, she came to know of the work of Boston College philosophy professor Carrie Cronin. The interests of these two women converged, and the result is the documentary movie The Dating Project, which premiered in spring of this year. Catherine travels around the country speaking on the issues of Catholic womanhood, dating, and wholesome relationships. Longtime viewers of EWTN may also recognize Catherine as one of the singing Fowler sisters that they used to run every year during the Christmas season. Catherine met her husband Brian in part because she decided to act on some of Dr. Cronin's advice for dating. And the two of them had a baby just a little over a year ago, November of last year, so they will be celebrating their first real Christmas with their daughter, Elodie. Please help me in welcoming Catherine Fowler Sample.
Thank you so much, Madonna, for that wonderful introduction and just your thoughts also about the subject of today, which is dating, and for all our communication leading up to today. Thank you also, Mary Ann, the president of this wonderful club, and thank you to all of you for coming here. What a testament to your love for the church, for family, and for dating. So, without further ado, when I speak with young people about dating and relationships across the country, I always begin with the same question, and that is, when was the last time you went on a date? And the qualification is you have to have known that it was a date. Sad you have to qualify that today, but you do. It cannot be a hangout. It cannot be a hookup. It couldn't be a text that said, "What's up? Do you want to get together?" It has to be an actual date. And in talking with hundreds of people over the last 4 years about dating, most people cannot say when the last time was that they went out on a date. And so this actually makes sense because for the first time in history, over 50% of America is single. And that's a startling statistic, but it's true. And it's because people don't know what a date is. And yet, as Madonna mentioned, people are wanting that romance. They want the spark, they want the charm, they want that thrill of the chase, but for some reason it's eluding us. And I was at a forum once, and a young man asked in the question and answer session, he was like, how do I even go on a date? Like, what are the actual words I should use? And it's something that almost sounds funny, but it's actually really serious. And this idea of how confusing the dating landscape is really hit me in a personal way when I was at a birthday party in Santa Monica, California, and it was attended by about a dozen women in their 20s and 30s. Everyone was a professional working mostly in the entertainment industry, very beautiful inside and out. And I looked around at one point during the evening and realized that every woman there was single. And there wasn't really a good reason for that. And so that really sparked in me this thought that we have a dating deficit. And a deficit is, as we know, when there's not enough of something going around. And we think of it with money, but it can easily apply to dating. And so then, as a filmmaker, I thought, what better way to pursue finding out what's at the heart of dating relationships than through a documentary. And so the Dating Project was born. And now some of you may have seen the movie when it came to theaters in April. It's also available at Walmart and Target and on Amazon if you want to stream it. But I thought Jay could play the trailer for us so you can get a little bit of an overview of what the movie is about. Oh, yeah.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, can you hear me a little better? Okay, great. I wonder if I should even... Yeah, I'll just speak closer into the microphone. But as I was just saying that we're going to watch the trailer of the Dating Project so you guys can get an overview of the movie if you didn't get a chance to see it in theaters.
What's up? How you doing? Good. Nice to meet you. You are really attractive. I'm nervous.
My name is Zenia Lucia Campos Gutierrez. I am single.
My name's Shanzi. Hi, boys.
I'm Chris. I'm an active listener.
My name is Matt Shelton, and I am single.
It's like single, married, and then there's extra single, and that's the one that I would check off.
What is dating?
Dating in today's society is cruel.
I don't really think that anyone knows how to date. Like, it's not a skill that our generation really has.
In college, I would definitely say hooking up is 100% more common than dating.
Story of boy meets girl. Girl really likes boy. Girl thinks that boy really likes girl.
I wish it could just be old school. You know, like he looked at me, I looked away.
There's not that, gentleman and lady kind of feel to dating.
There's no limits anymore. Like, making out isn't hooking up anymore. It's way further than that.
There's a ridiculous amount of pressure on people. Mr. Close Enough is out there. Mr. Perfect, he's nowhere to be found.
About 8 or 9 years ago, I realized that students weren't dating, and I sort of was finding out things about hookup culture, and I thought, well, this is crazy. So I started asking students to go on what I refer to as traditional dates.
I don't know if this is why I'm single, but the only thing I ask of a woman is that they replace you. Is that bad? Is that bad? Do you think women turn away from that?
Oh, heaven's sakes.
So, sounds like you guys like the trailer. But yes, that is a little bit of a window into the film. And as you guys could see from some of the text on the screen, we followed 5 single people who encapsulated the dating landscape of today throughout different age groups. There was there were actually college students at Boston College, a 20-something woman who had been single for 5 years, a 30-something woman who had prioritized career over relationships, and a 40-something man who felt commitment limited him. And the thesis of the movie when we started out was that there's no social script for dating. And so what is a social script? It's the unwritten rules of the culture. It's like today at this luncheon, we all have the social script of manners. You know to put the napkin on your lap. You know what fork to use. And it's because we learned that growing up. We got it from our parents. But it's amazing when you think about how the social script applies throughout other areas that go beyond manners. And dating is one of those places. But if you weren't taught how to date, then it makes sense that you wouldn't know how to date. And so I think that was a disconnect that happened from the older generation to the new, because when I talk with people who are maybe of the baby boomer generation, or even people who might have met and married in the early 2000s, their dating experience is like night and day difference to what people are dealing with today. And it's really amazing because, like Madonna mentioned, the world is starting to kind of pick up on that there's something wrong with the way people are meeting and falling in love, because it's not really happening anymore. And so there's another clip from the movie that really gives a good overview of what the dating landscape looks like. And I think you guys are going to like it because it was filmed in a pretty amazing city, which is Chicago.
You know, they tell you that life is going to go super fast. Well,
Rare to see someone dating, but when I do see them, I definitely clap. That's great.
We may be having too much technological difficulty to play it. Well, it's okay. I can give you guys an overview. It's not going to be probably as fun as watching it on screen, but the woman, Cecilia, she was born in Monterrey, Mexico, grew up there, and then was going to school for architecture in Chicago. And she said that dating in the United States is very difficult. And that she says in the interview that they say you should meet somebody when you go to college. And she's like, you really should, because it's really hard to meet and connect with people when you graduate. And then just made the observation that when her mom was her age in this documentary, she's 25, she had already married, and she had her brother and then her sister. And so she'd already had 2 kids by the time she was Cecilia's age. And she was saying, our generation seems to be totally different. And then she also said that she went out with this guy, and they'd gone out for like 3 weeks. And that she asked him, like they've been consistently going out frequently. And so she asked him, well, what is this? And he's like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, are we dating? And then he said, well, we're dating, but we're not dating. And she said, then he kind of like froze and got really uncomfortable. And she was so frustrated. She's like, anything would have been better than that. Like, give me something, like at least say, you know what, we're actually not in a relationship, we're still getting to know each other. But it's just this ambiguity that young people are having to deal with. And so that's really the gist of the clip. And after seeing the clip, and I'm sure just throughout the first part of this talk, and then just in life in general, we can wonder, how did we get here? And like we already mentioned, there's been different, even secular publications. Vanity Fair did a piece on the dating apocalypse, talking about Tinder, talking about, all the dating apps, hooking up. And what's happened is that the social script for dating has been replaced by the social script for hooking up. And so what is hooking up? It was first referred to in a 1993 article in the New York Times, but really came into more common usage in the early 2000s. And what it is, we're going to keep this PG, but it's anything. It could be casual kissing to actually having sex, but the idea is that it's supposed to be ambiguous. So you could be like, oh my gosh, I hooked up with a guy last weekend. Or a guy could be like, oh, I hooked up with 3 girls last weekend. And then you're kind of like, oh, cool, social cachet, you hooked up, but nobody really knows what happened. And that's really the power of hookup culture, and that no one really ever knows what happened. You can't really expect commitment from a hookup, even though a lot of times that happens thinking that, okay, well, I'm going to get into a relationship with this person. But an interesting fact that shows how we've really been moving towards the culture we're in is that an invention actually really sparked hookup culture. And it wasn't something that happened in the 1960s. It was really at the turn of the 20th century, and that was the invention of the car. And it's because people were able to drive away, literally, from family when they were dating. And the idea was that you could go out unchaperoned. One sociologist put it really well. She said things went from the front porch to the back seat. And it's true, because my mom was even saying, when I told her this, she was like, oh my gosh, my great Aunt Helen warned me about those boys who wanted to park and spark. And so, it was a real thing. And clearly we can see how the point of bringing that up is that we have this groundwork that's been laid for over a century that led us from hand-holding to hookup. And an interesting fact is that people say, the young people that we interviewed, said that it's a bigger deal to hold hands with someone than it is to hook up with them. And the professor in the film, who we're going to talk about more in a couple minutes, but she said that she noticed with students, they're more comfortable taking off each other's clothes and doing God knows what than going out for a cup of coffee. And she's like, what does that say about our society? And so we can see that the thing too, when we talked with people, we went all around the country. We went to 5 major cities, and we went to a couple small cities, and we did a ton of different interviews. And we would just go up to people on the street with the camera and be like, hey, we're doing a documentary on dating. Do you want to talk about it? And they were like, yes. And so it's like everyone wants to talk about dating. And the other thing is everyone's dissatisfied with what is going on. And it's because hookup culture has done 3 things that have really hurt everyone. And one is that in the Atlantic article that Madonna mentioned, a young person said that we hook up because we have no social skills, and we have no social skills because we hook up. And it's this idea that we don't know how to interact just in a regular way anymore. And that has really affected people being able to go out on a date, just being able to say those words. And the second thing that hookup culture has done is that it's made sex cheap. It's not special anymore. Something that used to consummate a marital relationship is now often the initiator of a relationship or just an encounter, and there will be no relationship. And it's like the idea of hookup culture, I also like to say it's not just an action that happens at a party. It's really a culture, it's a mentality, and different things go into that, like cohabitation, that is hookup culture. Pornography, that is hookup culture. And it's easy to think, oh, you know what, that's just stuff that some other people are doing, but not the kids I know, or not the people I know. But the sad thing is, even if the young person you know isn't engaging in those behaviors, they're being affected by the mentalities because other people around them are. And one of the most heart-wrenching parts in the documentary was when Cecilia, the girl from Chicago, is having a girls' night with friends, and they're talking, and pornography comes up, and Cecilia has a problem with her boyfriend watching porn. He's not. She's just theoretically saying that she has a problem with the idea of that. And the other girls are like, well, why would that be a problem? You like to watch cooking shows. He likes to watch porn. And that was just like, whoa. But that is the attitude that people are projecting now. And it drives the third point, which is low commitment culture. And so you have people who are really suffering who are doing the right things, but they can't meet people because there's a really interesting short film done by the Austin Institute, Mark Rigneris. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him, but he's a fantastic person who's done a lot of work around this subject, and it's called The Economics of Sex. And the idea is that in economics, it's like supply and demand. If the supply is low, then the demand is high. And that's how it used to be with sex, because it wasn't something that you could just get on the internet or from anyone who you swiped right with. But now that it's so common, people who are withholding that as something sacred are really suffering because no one wants to work. No one wants to do that relationship work. No one wants to say, you know what, I care enough about you to wait for marriage and do all the things that you have got to do in a relationship that are difficult. And so this is how we got to the point where hookup culture has become the dominant social script and has eclipsed dating. And if you read that article in The Atlantic, it is very depressing. It's sickening. And if you feel that way, it's a good thing because it means you haven't been brainwashed by our culture. And we realize we need to have a solution. And these secular articles are not giving us a solution. But in the documentary, one of the big things we wanted to do was offer ideas for how we can turn this around. And one of the people we interviewed is Dr. Carrie Cronin of Boston College. And yeah, one of the people we interviewed was Dr. Carrie Cronin of Boston College. She's the head of the philosophy department there. And she was an amazing person. Number one, we have my sister to thank because I ended up finding her because she sent me a Facebook article that she'd come across. So it was a very providential Facebook message, but it was about this professor who assigned her students to go on what she referred to as traditional dates. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is like bingo, perfect, exactly what we're looking for. And so she, even though she teaches a philosophy class, it's a small segment of her class that she does around Valentine's Day of every year. And so she, long story, it kind of was alluded to in the trailer, but she went out to ice cream with a bunch of college seniors around 10 years ago. And they were talking about their post-graduation plans, and it came up as to whether or not anyone was engaged. And she was surprised to find out that no one was. And she had gone to Boston College herself many years ago, and it was very common for that school people to meet and match off by the time they graduated. But she was even more surprised to find out that none of them had been on a date in their entire four-year college career. And so this made her think, what if I assign my students to go out on a date? And so she did that in the next semester. And she found that all the students were really interested and they wanted to go on the date, but by the end of the semester, no one had. And so then this sparked her to actually go forward with creating an assignment with rules. And that's what she did. And so she calls it level 1 dating. And there's all these rules. It's kind of like dating 101. And so she goes over it with her students. And there's rules like you have to ask in person. You cannot text, which seems like a no-brainer, but not today. The person you ask needs to be a legitimate romantic interest. The person must know it's a date. It must be under $10, so it kind of creates a low-pressure environment just to get to know each other. It should be no longer than 90 minutes, because as she says, no one is interesting after 3 hours. And then you ask, you pay. And then 2 others, you need to have no drugs and alcohol involved. And it needs to be A-frame hugs only. That's the only physical contact you can have. That always gets a snicker from students. But when we were there, we filmed this assignment, and then afterward, the students, we filmed them and their reactions, and a lot of them were kind of like, who is this professor asking us to go out on a date? Like, how can this even be an assignment? But then they said, after we caught up with them after they'd done the assignment, they were like, we're actually really glad that we were challenged to do this because it's something we would never have done otherwise. Like, we hadn't dated since our middle school days, as one boy put it. And so it was a good thing. And the really interesting thing is that students, they were hungry for guidance, and they were hungry for rules, which is really interesting, considering we're living in an age where there's practically no rules to anything. And in addition to the assignment, Professor Cronin, she gives a talk every year that's just open to anyone, and it's also around Valentine's Day. And we filmed it, and it was amazing because it was a bitter, cold night. I mean, you guys know cold in Chicago, but Bostonians might argue they know it more. And I mean, it was just freeze your face off cold. And yet people showed up, and it was 1,100 students came to hear her talk. And it was amazing. Like, there was overflow in the giant lecture hall. People were in the hallways. People were in the stairwells. Don't tell the fire marshal. But yeah, there was all this energy just to hear, you know, how can we learn how to date? And the kids didn't even have their phones out, which is crazy, because I feel like you can barely have a conversation with someone you know without like them being like, oh, I've got to send a text really quick. But everyone was just very enchanted and enthralled with this idea of reviving the lost art of courtship. And Carrie Cronin, she talks about the idea kids are interested in this, and young people in general, and anyone who's dating, they want a way out of stepping outside the dominant social script of hookup culture, and yet no one is offering it to them. And she makes the point that you need to learn how to date in your earlier years, because then you're going to be in your 20s not knowing how to date, and she put it, that's just silly. And the sad thing is it's a little more than silly, because the most surprising thing about the documentary, a lot of people ask me, like, what was the most surprising thing you learned? And I would say that it was that we interviewed the 5 different subjects. We followed them, totally different ages, totally different backgrounds. I thought it may be difficult to weave their stories together because they might not have a lot in common, but it turned out they all had a ton in common. And they all had the same problems. And it's because they're going off that script from their younger years, and they're not getting out of it. It's not something that the kids these days are just going to grow out of. So that requires us retraining our hearts in how to date with dignity. And that's really one of the core points of the documentary. And dignity comes from the old French word, which means worthy. And so the idea is we need to be acting worthy of our calls as son and daughter of God. We need to be treating other people with worth. And it's crazy because we live in a time when that's just not happening. I mean, people are on their phones when they're checking out. They're not even going to give the checker the time of day to say hello. We don't respect the unborn. I mean, we savage people on Twitter like they're not a real person. So this idea is actually very radical. And it's one of the reasons that I think this movie is really resonating with people, and this concept of actually dating with dignity, because it's something everyone's so hungry for. And so I feel like there's 3 ways that we can really do this. And the first is that we need to strive to make real connections. And it's interesting because we live in a time when we can connect with almost anyone. It's like you have a problem with your computer, well, you're going to be talking to someone from India. I mean, you can Facebook a friend from France. Even the different things we have in the store, exotic fruits or something, like a couple decades ago that wouldn't have been around, but now we just take it for granted. But the irony is, in this time of being so connected, we're very disconnected. And that really leads us to talk about technology. And a lot of people ask, well, how has technology changed relationships? And I would say, well, how has technology not changed relationships? And one of the stories in the documentary that's really powerful is the man, Chris, who was in his 40s. He was in New York, and he was posting a bunch of pictures to social media. He was on a ferry, and he said he was having a really good time, and then his phone died. And he had no way to charge it. And he said all of a sudden this deep sense of loneliness came over him. And he really felt like, I want a friend, I want a companion, I want to be in a real relationship with someone. And this was really a profound story because a lot of us are kind of experiencing the same thing. But there's so much noise going on with technology that we don't even know that we're wanting that. And so another really interesting story that just illustrates the power of technology and how we might want to pull back a little bit is that a friend, his kids are in high school, and he said, you want to know the most interesting thing so far about raising teenagers? And I was like, well, I'll be there in a couple of years, so yes. And then he said, it's that they have no interest in driving. And he was like, this was really shocking. And he said, and that used to kind of be a metric, like if you were driving, it was meaning you were kind of moving towards adulthood. But anyways, he said that's how he would go and connect with people, get out of the house. But he said he realized they don't care about driving because they have their phones. And that's how they're connecting. It's like they'd rather be on a text chain than, go out and meet their friends in person. And so it's really something that is changing the entire dynamic of how we're interacting as a culture. And another big thing that the phone does is it gives us the illusion of choices when it comes to dating apps. And that's a huge thing. I mean, online dating in the old days, it was sort of like You've Got Mail. You wandered into a chat room as a joke or something. But now it's just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And people have this illusion that, okay, I see so many people on social media. I see so many people on these dating apps. I have so many options. Like, there's so many people who would probably want to date me or who I would want to date. But the reality is that's not true. And there was a really interesting book written, I think in the 80s. It's The Paradox of Choice. And it's the idea, in it the author gives an analogy of people who go out looking for sweaters. And the people who go out to like 10 stores, trying on a ton of different sweaters, and then kind of going back to a few stores and then settling on one, versus the people who go to a store they like, they know they're looking for a black sweater, they try it on, they're like, okay, this looks good. The people that are more satisfied are the people who just try the sweater on and commit to it, versus the people who go out and look at a million. And this always goes along with like economics, like people who go to see 10 homes when they're looking for a home are going to have a harder time just deciding on which one they want versus like 3 or something like that. But the concept is there in that you're going to be less likely to make a choice. And if you think about it, and this is something that young people really need to hear, it's that if you think about the people who are going to align with you, number one, geographically, realistically, and then with personality, values, and vision for the future, your pool is actually quite small. I mean, it's nothing against you personally, but it's just we're not meant to connect with so many people. And going along this theme of connection, the second big thing that's so powerful in restoring this lost art of courtship culture and just relationship culture is generational connectedness. And I once heard a talk by a prominent Protestant speaker, and he said that the devil really strives to destroy generational connectedness, and that's how he does his work, because people then can't get almost the script of what life should be, which is men and women coming together, romance, family, parents imparting wisdom to their children. A lot of times people now feel very intimidated to do that, even as a parent. And it's because parents are portrayed as total idiots on TV. I mean, they're not upheld as like, oh, this is the generation who has wisdom. If anything, we're trying to kind of be teenagers, like, oh, you've got to get your smartphone and know how to work it. It's like parents have such gifts to give their children. And I met with a man actually once that said he had never had a meaningful conversation with his father. And he was really sad about that. Now, he never told his father that, but that tells us that parents should be speaking into the lives of their children. Grandparents should be speaking into the lives of their children to speak into the lives of their children. And that's the generational connectedness. And it's interesting, too, because the United States, I mean, we're naturally kind of disconnected in that there was a study that said the United States is one of the places that you just don't live next to your family of origin very often. It's like in Turkey, mom's next door, or maybe living in your house. But like in the United States, we're so spread apart. And so we can foster this through conversations, through eating together as a family, through, putting your phones even in like a little bin to say, okay, this is like a phone-free zone. Even on Christmas, what if nobody had their phone with them all day? I mean, maybe you could take pictures, but take mental pictures. That's what people used to do. It's sort of challenging these ways that we've just fallen into without really thinking about it that can kind of bring back. What it's bringing back is the non-sexual intimacy that is necessary to go forward and have romantic relationships. That's what's missing. And the Atlantic article was talking all about how there's no intimacy anymore, and it's because you don't just have intimacy through sex. I mean, that's not even intimate if you're not doing it with the emotional components that need to be there. And so we get those emotional components in a family environment. And so that's really what needs to be restored. And this leads me to the third point, which the biggest family we have is the family of the church. And it's the idea of Teresian spirituality. St. Therese, something that the church always used to do, it was the idea of like offer it up. We used to not eat meat on Fridays. Now we do often eat meat on Fridays. I mean, the majority of people don't know that that rule is actually still kind of there. But what if we all prayed and fasted on Fridays for a restoration of dating and courtship culture? That would be a beautiful thing. And it's amazing because we live in an era where everyone's willing to do like a 5K for a cause. But this is like a spiritual 5K to restore what we've lost. So that's something really powerful that we can underestimate the power of. And so it's really encouraging because we don't have to wait on a big institution for this to change. It's actually something that we can do person to person, heart to heart. And that's because that's how it broke down. And that's how the restoration will happen. And the purpose of the dating project was twofold. One was to let people know what's going on with dating culture, to see how we've really had a collapse in courtship, it's radically changed. But two, it's to encourage people to date differently and start having those conversations. It's really a launch pad for conversation. And Madonna was saying there's a middle school even that's showing the dating project, which is great because the movie was done in a way that has a lot of decorum and dignity. So it's like you could watch it with a grandparent and not get totally uncomfortable. And it's because we need to be having these challenging conversations, because if you're not having the challenging conversations with your children or even your grandchildren, then somebody else is. And they're not going to be telling them what the church says. They're not going to be telling them what's going to make them truly happy in God's design. And it's funny because dating may seem like a very lighthearted topic, but I think it's the most important topic of our day. It's the on-ramp to marriage and family, and it will impact the type of society we have like nothing else. And there's a line from the Brothers Karamazov, it's everyone is really responsible to all men, and for everything. And it's this idea of radical responsibility for one another that we need to reclaim and that we're called to as Catholics. And so I hope you feel encouraged and emboldened to support the cause for dating differently and dating with dignity. Thank you.
How have the dating apps affected dating, and is it really dating that's going on in most of the cases?
Well, that's a great question. So the question is, how have dating apps affected dating, and is dating really even going on in most cases with people using dating apps? I would say there's two answers. One, like technology, you can use it for good or ill. It's not necessarily bad in and of itself. So I mean, that's how I think of the dating apps, and that you can get on one that's more hookup specific, like Tinder definitely has that reputation, where people are just kind of going out to hook up. I think even those people are ultimately seeking something deeper, but they're doing it in the wrong way. But the other good side to these apps is that I think it's actually one of the only places where people can go to actually say, okay, I am here to date. Because that's what it's there for. Like, you cannot go up to someone in the grocery store anymore. It's considered too weird. It's like even calling someone practically on a cell phone. It's like if someone's calling you, it's like, wait, has someone died? Like, why are you calling me and not texting? So it's that kind of thing where it creates a situation and environment where people are there because they're looking for a relationship. And so that can actually be a very good thing. So I always say about, online, the apps, it can be used wisely and well. And an interesting statistic from Stanford University was that they are now doing like a Stanford dating experiment instead of the Stanford prison experiment. But anyways, I thought that was pretty funny. But they have a study that says people who meet online are more likely to get married and quicker than people who are now meeting in kind of, I guess, the wild. But it's interesting, and I think it's because that intentionality is there. It's like, you know what, we're sick and tired of all the hookup, we're sick and tired of all the empty parties, we want to meet someone for real. And so there can be a good side to the dating apps if you're using the right ones.
Okay, Judy?
I want to thank you for this talk. I deal with a lot of conservative Catholics and young people in education. And what I found recently is you have one of two. Either you have the hookup culture, there's no question, or then you have the courtship culture, which is not what you're talking about. It's where you barely know each other. I guess that family, the 17 kids accounting or whatever, that's where you don't even kiss before you get married. And I think that led to this idea that going out for a cup of coffee is somehow evil unless you bring your younger brother with you. And I think so. This is very refreshing, and I wanted to thank you for it.
Well, I'm glad you say that because I'm a real advocate of the idea of casual dating, and that it's like casual, make dating casual again, make sex not casual, and it shouldn't be a bad thing to go to coffee with someone. And it's really like it's the art of just meeting each other. And we're living in the modern age. Unfortunately, we're not living in like 13th century Scotland where William Wallace is going to come by on his horse and it's like you're going to get married in 2 weeks. Like that is not how most of the world works. So the people who do courtship, I mean, I admire their standards, but it's not really something that's going to relate to most people, mainly because we don't live in a like family-centric environment. Like how are you going to court if you're in college? You're off to college and your parents aren't there to watch you. So, I mean, the idea of casual dating is that there's high accountability and you're really trying to move towards a serious relationship if that's what's going to be good for you both as a couple. And Carrie Cronin talks about this. She's got different levels. So level 1 is like 3 dates, she puts a cap on it, like these kind of casual little coffee dates. And then if you're really interested in the person, you would move on to level 2, which is like an exclusive relationship. And then you eventually would move on to level 3, where it's like, this is getting more serious. We're thinking about maybe getting married. Like, this is somebody who I could really consider. And then level 4 would be engagement. And so the idea of casual dating is, ironically enough, going out to coffee and having that kind of low pressure environment to start it out really creates almost more high pressure moving towards that commitment.
I just as a follow-up, part of that courtship culture is if somebody wants to ask you out, they have to go to your dad and say, I'm very seriously interested in your daughter and I'd like her. Maybe she doesn't even want to have a cup of coffee with the guy, but he's already got home and talked to dad, and it puts a level of seriousness there that it's something that doesn't belong there.
That is so true, and that's something that people really struggle with in the church. Not necessarily courtship in that way, like asking the father, because that's just not as common. But like in the church environment, sometimes if you're more serious and you're not like into hooking up, you're like, okay, well, this coffee date, like this could be it. And then you put all this like expectation on going out to coffee with this guy who's probably just like, oh, what am I gonna, I don't know, have for lunch later? And so it's like we've got to kind of tone it back down and be cool about the idea of just going out to meet, see if your personalities are compatible, and then you move forward. And that's a big thing in the documentary. It's about that trajectory. It's like a woman who we interviewed who's a psychotherapist, she said she meets people who've been dating 5 years and she's like, oh, are you guys thinking about getting married? And then people are like, no, we've never talked about it. And she's like, never talked about it? Like, you guys should be married already. So anyways, that's the thing about this idea of the dating and the way it's described in the movie, and that It's not that kind of old-fashioned traditional courtship. And that's one thing that's interesting, in that courtship has evolved. I mean, it's not like new ways are bad per se. It's like there was a time when there were arranged marriages and that was working for society. I mean, I'm not advocating that, but like you kind of gradually go through, like even there were different versions of dating from the 50s to the 60s, you know, the World War II era to kind of how it is today. So you have to adjust to whatever era you're in, but you have to still hold on to those old values that are tried and true and that are going to lead us to happy relationships.
Okay, all right, Amy?
One thing, I love the movie. We saw it when it opened in April. I've talked about it nonstop to everyone I know since, and I have 5 kids in this age group, so it applies. So I have a very practical question. If you're, for instance, as my kids, we've had the conversation, we get the rules, you know, we've had conversations their whole lives, but they're out there, short of the Boston College, here are the rules, like everybody knows the rules. How do you have a young person want to casually date when the people that they're, like, do they have to say, well, these are my rules? Like, right? Like, and so I don't know exactly how.
I could have it on a card.
Yeah, like just because I think I have a daughter who's 24, who's great, and I think she kind of, like in the movie, I think she kind of avoids because she doesn't want to have a conversation. Will it lead to like they're expecting sex or you know what I mean? And so I think you want to have the other party on the same page as you.
Right.
And I'm not exactly sure how you do that until the whole culture changes, which might take a while.
Yeah.
So.
that's kind of the crux of the problem,
Right.
and that, for example, my brother, he's in college and he's on the road team at the University of Kansas, and he and a bunch of his friends went to see the movie, and they're all nice guys, but they were like, you know what, we're going to go out on a date. I mean, it's kind of like that's just the basic. It's got to start so simple. And you might get somebody who you ask out on a date. I would say this, most men who ask a woman out on a date will get a positive response. I mean, unless the woman is just, maybe she really doesn't like the guy already and they knew each other. But there's different ways to go about it. One, I would say you almost can't say, do you want to go out on a date anymore? Like, don't use those words because it's almost too much. It's like, wait a second. there's a little bit of commitment attached to that word. But it's just the idea of, hey, would you like to go out for coffee? You know, I'd love to get to know you, like that kind of thing. And then you just, it's like an odds game. You're going to eventually connect with someone who has the right personality. And this is something else, like being with the same values. Like if you can connect with someone who's really going to look at you as a person, there are people out there, even who might not have your carbon copy values, they're going to work with you. If you're going to hold the line, especially as a woman. And that's the power of women keeping sex as something sacred for marriage. And it's like we were talking about with the economics of sex. You know, she'll meet the guy who's willing to put it all on the line and be like, no, you know what, you are worth it as a person to me, and it'll change his life for the better. And so that's just what I would encourage. And then one other thing that Carrie Cronin said in the just interviews that didn't make it in the film, but she said it's actually only supposed to work once. You're not supposed to like meet the perfect person multiple times. So it is like you've got to kind of prep your brain to be like, I know that there's going to be rejection. I know there's going to be bad dates, you know, that just don't go great. But it's all about moving towards meeting that right person.
And I think that rejection is an interesting concept for this generation. I think they're very adverse to rejection. So I had a conversation the night of the movie with the son who was going to ask me out. He's like, what if she says no? I said, then ask somebody else out. I mean, but it's like there's that fear of rejection I also think is maybe part of this.
It's part of getting participation trophies for everything.
Yeah, I think that's sort of
it is. Yeah, well, and we have an interesting, generation of people. There was a lot of helicopter parenting. Right. It's like even parents that if a teacher said something about their kid at school, they were going to call school and be like, no, you know what, Johnny's great. What are you talking about? You know, I mean, it's like, and the parents did all the fighting for them, so they didn't really have to face that. But it's part of what we were talking about, even with the social skills that are being lost. A social skill is being able to face rejection. And it's like we're able to do it in jobs, you apply to colleges, you have safe schools. I mean, it is all about kind of giving people that, so you were so right, giving them that pep talk to be like, put the pressure off yourself. If they don't like you, someone else will. And if they don't like you, nothing against them, but they're obviously not the right person because you only want to be with someone who really likes you. I mean, it's very basic psychology, but it does get confusing and it is really stressful because we're living in that world where you post something online and it's like, dear God, please let me get at least 100 likes, or I'm going to have to remove it and pretend I didn't post it, So, I mean, the struggle is real for kids and young people, and that's why it's like a lot of compassion is needed for these conversations. It's like I would say, don't do judgmental, shame-based conversations. It needs to be like, we recognize these are the real fears, and this is how we overcome them. And then they're going to have the right tools to go out and do it.
Okay, back there, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you know Jane Driver at Harvard? Are you familiar with her work?
I'm not familiar with it.
How about Reclaiming Conversation, Sherry Turkle's book?
You know what, I'm not.
Okay, so Jane Driver, I was just saying, I went to BC and I'm well aware of the dating project, but so Dr. Jane Driver is an oncologist at Harvard University. She's a Catholic, and she's done a lot of studies on the impact of using iPhones on these kids. And one of the precursors and problems before the hookup culture, and I have millennials, 26 and 28, so fortunately they escaped some of this. But she says kids today, because of technology, cannot read other people. And I would encourage people, if you want to choose. So she said they have the emotional intelligence of like an 8th grader is like a 3rd grader. And this book called Reclaiming Conversation, for example, is one of the ones she read. She gave a talk in Chicago recently. And the author, Sherry Turkle, it's really interesting. They show a prep school principal that gives very detailed information about how these 8th graders, they literally cannot read other people. Like somebody's hurting somebody's feelings, and they don't even see it because they have so little face-to-face interaction.
Mm-hmm.
When they're young, because of technology, because they're over-programmed, they're just not used to dealing with it. So by the time they get to college, it's even harder. So it's not impossible. It's very interesting. The study's fascinating. They say that's the #1 problem that's hurting teenagers most. We think it's attention spans, or they said, no, it's emotion. That suppresses emotion. So
that is scary. Yeah, well, it is really interesting. My husband and I were actually just talking about the study that came out, and it's brain scans of kids who watch 7 hours a day of screen somehow versus those who do not. And then first we were like, wait, 7 hours? How could a child watch 7 hours of screen time? But then I thought, well, I see the kids at the bus stop. They're waiting for the bus for at least 45 minutes. They're all on their phone. Then, they might have a lunch break. They have an extracurricular time. Then that's 3 hours during the day. Then you just need 4 hours at night. I mean, it is possible that we could be spending 7 hours a day on our phone, but that their brains in the social development area were not as developed if they were having that screen be so prevalent in their life. And I know there's another documentary that's coming out. It's called Screenagers, and it addresses some of the same things you mentioned. But yeah, that's why reclaiming this, as I said, it's that social interaction, that non-sexual intimacy that you used to get in family settings. People were churned out of families. I mean, granted, there's always been dysfunctional families, but families used to sit together and talk. And I know a girl recently who went to Thanksgiving at her boyfriend's house, and no joke, no one spoke during the whole meal. That's strange.
Well, she knows now he's not the guy.
Well, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, it's crazy because that's kind of where we're at. Or even like basic follow-up questions, like even interacting with people. I mean, sometimes I'll even be talking to people and they'll just talk about themselves. I mean, it's like, my mom always said, conversations like tennis. You volley the ball over and then it comes back to you and then you volley the ball back. I mean, that's the kind of stuff people were learning since their earliest years that we're no longer learning. And so I think the big thing that we can take away is that this is more of like a social change. It's literally transforming the type of people who are going to be caring for people. I mean, it's scary. And it really actually is scary because there's a lack of, not having emotional intelligence. That's one of the big things that makes us human. Empathy. Yeah, and empathy is what sociopaths do not have. That's what makes someone a sociopath. And so it's like, that's why we really have to, if you have the power, if your children are in the house, if you have, the ear of your child who has children who are still in the house, people need to start restructuring the way they're doing family. And that's how it's going to start changing. And, you know, you can even restructure amongst yourself. I mean, have these conversations, because sometimes it's like the frog in boiling water. We're all just participating in this social experiment of totally restructuring the way we're relating to one another as human beings. And it's like using cell phones. I mean, we're all using these cell phones. It's probably not great for us, but we're all doing it. Everybody's got a cell phone. And I mean, it may not even be great for our brains, literally, but it's like, it's the same thing as going on socially. And so it's really, really stepping back and like pulling the reins back, because things are getting more and more out of control. And so we have a chance to do that. And there is an element of society that craves this, like even the kind of vintage vibe, the retro vibe is coming back in, like with fashion. People are very dissatisfied with what's happening now. And I think it's just giving people that idea. Like, what if we put our phones down? Like, my husband and I did this thing that was like kind of a media fast and like an actual sort of fast. You didn't eat between meals, that sort of thing, for 90 days. And it was like amazingly transformative. And I would say we're pretty connected people, but it really made us like, we didn't decompress by like, well, maybe we got on our computer or our phone and soccer was just on the TV. It's like we didn't do that. We like listened to audiobooks. We talked more than we usually did. I mean, even we have a policy, we never have our phones. Like when we're getting ready for bed, we're not on our phones and we're talking. It's creating these rules in a society that has no rules, because that's the thing about the phone. It's so invasive. Like even with your job, it used to be you could only be reached during work hours. But now it's like, oh, sorry, forgot to send this email out at 8:22. It's like annoying. I'm at home. So it's a crash of boundaries, and that's what. It's all very symbolic. I mean, all the different boundaries, sexual, social, whatever. We need to reestablish the boundaries in order to get our society back to being functional and empathetic.
My husband has a question to ask.
Yes.
Just last week, I was reading on the internet a restaurant that requires you to check your cell phone when you come in. And I think it's a great idea. When you go to a restaurant now, the family's there, everybody in the family is on the phone the whole meal.
It's not a family meal, really.
And I should have researched it a little bit more and found out where it was and what kind of restaurant it was, because I'd go there.
Right. Wow, that's amazing.
Did you have a question back there?
Yeah, I have a question. So being like a girl in college, should I be talking to guys that are part of this hookup culture and trying to change basically the way they were raised fully, or just waiting for that guy who was raised to ask me on a date and open the door?
Right, well, that is a great question, and that is something we were kind of talking about earlier. It's a real conundrum. I am a 50-50 person, and that I believe you could meet someone that's accustomed to hookup culture, and they could change and not be doing that if you were going to hold that standard. But you would have to obviously be in a situation where you're not like risking your own, virtue to like really work with somebody. I mean, they've got to be like normal enough that they can get where you're coming from. So that, I would say, one. And then two, that waiting. I mean, you can also wait. But women have an interesting role. It's hard because like in the documentary, it is men and women ask each other out. Like women also ask out. If we're being totally honest, a lot of times it doesn't seem to work that way. It's almost always better when the guy asks you out. Now, I'm not saying that, carte blanche. I mean, it's obviously blanket statement. Sometimes it works the other way around. But the one thing women have forgotten and that feminism has really destroyed, it's what I like to call dropping the handkerchief. It's like the Jane Austen days. They dropped their handkerchief, and then the guy that they were interested in picked it up and was like, oh, here you go. Like, it's these little subtle ways of kind of catching a guy's interest in like a totally normal, non-sexual way. That's what flirting used to be. Now flirting is kind of a dirty word, but like we've lost the art of flirting because we don't have that complementarity of men and women, because a lot of times women are trying to be like men and now men are trying to be like women. So it makes things confusing, but it's like if you can kind of do that, I mean, you could also be like, oh, just those hints of like, somehow I'd like to get to know you, or even if you see them on Facebook at the same time, like, hey there, just sort of opening the door for the man to be able to ask you out. And I mean, another way is trying, if possible, like even with your friends, like watching this movie. I mean, it can kind of spark it, or like even talking about it with someone, like, oh, you'll never believe I saw this movie, and it's like advocating going out on dates. Like, what do you think of that? And then hopefully they're not thick enough to be like, I don't know what to think of it. But hopefully they'll be like, oh yeah, you know what, that's cool. Like maybe we could get coffee sometime. But yeah, so it's very tough. But I think it gets really tiring because you're kind of like putting yourself out there, and sometimes it doesn't go well. But it's like it's all about sort of trying different avenues. So I say you can do both. I mean, that's the other thing. You can never rule people out totally. I mean, as far as most people go, like I was at an event with my husband, and there was like 30 young people there, and all the women there were converts to the church, which was interesting except me. And I thought that was crazy. They were all married, to these guys who were Catholic. So, I mean, clearly they were able to meet these Catholic guys and, like, conform to their standards, which is weird because usually it's almost the other way around, that men are conforming to women's standards, but it's very possible. So I feel like open-mindedness is a good thing as long as you're meeting people who align with, I always say, personality, values, and vision for the future. And if they have a good heart. And like that's the baseline for kind of, okay, this seems like a good person. And then maybe we can kind of work through some of our different opinions so that we get on the same right page.
Okay.
I think I'm 100% with you. I'm old school. I'm not old fashioned. I text. I think the biggest problem is the texting with the young kids because they miss what we miss. If I didn't come here today, right, that'd be like texting. I came here, I met this guy, we had something in common, where he lives, and I think that's the biggest thing that has to be broken down. I buy cars. I've bought cars for years. Since 1969, I've been a car collector. I found a car in Oregon. My sister lives 40 miles from this car. It's an old BMW. So it would put BMW on the map. The kid that had this car, he didn't sell it on eBay. Works at the University of Chicago, does their computer stuff. He's in his 40s, right? Hardly ever talks to his mother on the phone. I had to buy the car through a couple texts. And thank God his mother helped me. She told me a little bit about the car. I never even talked to the guy. Never even talked. I think that's the biggest problem.
Yeah, that's what we're missing. And there's an element of risk involved with that. It's like that awkward conversational silence that people are almost so afraid of. It's like the rejection thing. It's sort of realizing there's going to be awkwardness. Like, I read an article that said we're actually more similar to the Jane Austen era through texting than we realize because everything's so carefully crafted. It's like you can wait and give a response. It's almost killing the natural emotional responses we should be having, like as knee-jerk sort of. It's like, well, guess what they texted me? What do you think I should write back? And after you run it by a couple of friends, you check your punctuation and send. So yeah, it is. It's all about restoring that face-to-face communication, and that's what we saw in the movie. Like the guy who went on the date, who was in college, was like just glowing after it, just like to have that conversation for 90 minutes with this girl that I'd been interested in. It was so much better than like any other way I could have spent that hour. But to have someone so elated after just having a conversation with someone, it's further proof we're not having these conversations. And so yeah, like sharing those thoughts, I think it's all about really getting getting assertive. Because sometimes I don't know, not to say religious people are never assertive, but like we can be kind of more like, oh, should I say that? I might offend somebody. It's like you don't have to say it offensively, but you can say it assertively. You can put an opinion out there, and if somebody doesn't agree with you, then that's fine, but it might change the way they're thinking, especially if it's a young person. And we've got some great opportunities coming up with Christmas, getting back together as a family. I mean, you could even say, like, let's put our phones away for the day, kind of do what that restaurant did. I mean, you can kind of put forth ideas, and you might get pushback, and that's fine, but it's sort of like accepting. It goes along with that rejection. Standing up for the standards that we know are good might be a little awkward, but it's like it's so worth it because otherwise it's just all going to keep going down the drain.
Okay, back there. Yes.
Is this available as a DVD?
It is. It's at Target, Walmart, and also on Amazon.
I have a 30-year-old son who's coming home for Christmas.
Yeah. No.
I approached the subject with him.
I will tell you too that the young man here films our talks, and we have our own TV channel on YouTube, and it's Catholic Citizens TV, and you can watch the Luncheon speaker. You can show this to your son. About him, right? About him. Okay, go ahead.
I brought the DVD. I introduced it to my daughter's all-girls high school, and it's going to be, I think, a little tricky to try to get it in. But have you had successful screenings that the high schools actually purchase, like a group? Do you have a group screening license?
There is a group screening license. You can go to the datingprojectmovie.com and then arrange a screening that way. But it is very great for high schoolers because I mentioned we did it with a lot of dignity and decorum so that it touches on these darker subjects in a way that is still appropriate. It's not graphic. It is something that anyone can see, which really is a mark of the gospel. Like anyone should be able to hear this and then be kind of moved. And so that's what we wanted to do.
And do you have any sort of discussion guide?
There is a discussion guide, and it's through Ascension Press. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes?
I have a question on church attendance. I mean, if you look at previous generations, are the numbers down for millennials? Because I would think that church would be able to offer a real good venue for bringing young people together, like Newman Center, for example. How is that? That would seem to be, to me, to really empower kids, you know, to have the confidence because they have the gift of faith.
Yeah.
You know? And that should be their direction as they go forward.
Right. That's complicated because we really have lived in an era, millennials have been raised without a whole lot of catechesis. And people kind of had that attitude like, oh, the Baltimore Catechism, those days of learning question and answer, that's somehow oppressive and old-fashioned. But what it did was it laid the groundwork to understand why God was so great. And it wasn't just kind of a feel-good retreat thing. It was like a real depth of knowledge. And across the board, I would say most millennials have not gotten that, even if they've gone to Catholic school. There are exceptions. So I think the church being what used to be a natural avenue to go and like have that kind of community isn't always there. Now, sometimes it is there. So I'm saying there's churches that have community, but I don't think that's the first thought on most Catholic millennials' radar. And then the other issue that comes up is within the church communities, and this happens all the time with like question and answers at talks, is that it's like there's an awkwardness of like they always hang out, and so then they feel like they cannot ask people out. Because like, oh, well, what if it messes up the friendship, or it could be way, way too awkward. And I always say, one, you'll really mess up the friendship if you should have asked the person out and they could have been right for you. Two, it's worth risking that friendship if it matters so much. And it's like, even Carrie Cronin says, yeah, burn that friendship. You've got 1 million of them. I mean, people prioritize now friendship in a way that's sort of like, it's the Friends culture from the show from the 90s. It's this sort of tribal mentality. It was even mentioned in that article that people are almost more comfortable just being with their friends and sort of having those emotional needs met than being in a one-on-one relationship that's heterosexual. And honestly, it's because it's way more difficult to be in a one-on-one relationship as a guy and a girl, as a man and a woman. Entering into marriage, it's not for the faint of heart because it is a commitment. But that is the thing that goes on. There's a lot of awkwardness in trying to like break through the friend barriers that are in the church groups, but I would strongly advise to do that. But yeah, there's not that faith in a lot of ways with a lot of millennials, and a lot of them are no longer going to church. I mean, it's like we lived in an era where it was like everyone baptized their child, you know, generations back, and it was immediate. But now it's like parents have to ask their kids, like, well, when's the baptism going to be? And that pretty much says how much faith matters to young people if you've got to be asked when you're going to baptize your child. So that's where we're at.
Just one fast one. So have you noticed, I noticed in my counseling in pregnancy centers, marriage is no longer a goal. That is not a goal. If it happens, great, you know, and that's the exact language they use. Well, if it happens, that's wonderful. And so because it's not a goal, they don't know how to get on a path to reach the goal because it's not a goal.
Right. That's true. It is not a goal. And in fact, if you're a woman, and even a man who says, and this is in the documentary, that Lori Gottlieb, she says, and you say, I want to get married, like I'm getting to be almost 30, I want to get married, people are almost like, what's wrong with you? Like, you must be desperate. But then there is no trajectory of like, okay, if marriage is somehow an end goal, even sort of in the foggy future, no one's thinking that, oh, I have to be living a certain way and doing certain things and thinking a certain way in order to get there. And it's because we prioritized, there's nothing wrong, obviously, with college and careers, but that's what's been put first. It's like you have got to go to college, you've got to get out on your own 2 feet, you've got to be independent, and then it gets pretty messy if you've got marriage in the mix. It's like, it's just more complicated. And that, the other thing is, I mean, the divorce rate, it's sort of like the elephant in the room. I mean, many people have been divorced, so it kind of makes sense, too, that this attitude, children have come from divorce. I mean, how would you have the most positive attitude about that? It's almost like this desperation of like, I need to make sure I'm taken care of because I was abandoned in that way, or I saw what happened to my parents, and you know, she wasn't equipped with a career, and they split up. It's like there's so many different things that are going into this radical independence, and that's why we need that generational connectedness again, because God did not make man to be alone, as we know in Genesis, and so that is so true that you bring that up. That unfortunately, marriage isn't a goal, and that's why it's really good to encourage young people, connect with a mentor couple. Like, talk about marriage in a positive way. Because one thing I always found, being a woman who was single in Los Angeles and that I was unmarried for several years, people would practically be getting off a bus to tell me, oh my gosh, hold on to those single years. Like, you're so lucky to be single. Even women who were married. A woman, I taught catechism, and she was the catechism leader at this church, and she was like, oh my gosh, you're just so lucky to be single. Treasure these years. And it was like, okay, I mean, yeah, there's good elements to being single, but it really casts marriage in a bad light. So it's sort of checking ourselves even the way we talk about marriage, because that's diabolical, obviously, to have marriage be so poorly thought of generally in society. And it's because the devil doesn't want good marriages. The devil doesn't want good marriages because then there aren't going to be good children born to be baptized and part of the kingdom of heaven. It's a very spiritual thing that's going on here, but we don't see that just because we're sometimes so caught up in the everydayness of it all. But yeah, really drumming up how great marriage is. And if you're married, sing its praises. I always say, like, I love being married. And I love my husband, and he's great, and he did our dating relationship right. It's like, kudos to him. Props to you, Brian. I mean, because too many people complain about what's not right. It's good to hold up what's beautiful, because that's what people want to see. And then that could open up somebody's mind totally to marriage, to see a couple who's doing it right.
You know, there was a poll of high school students a number of years ago, and they asked them what would be their hopes and dreams of where they would be 10 years from then. And the majority of them said that they hoped they'd be married and have children and have a good job. The husband would have a good job. So that was a goal for a lot of people, but I think now they're afraid to say it maybe, or don't want people to know that because they'll think they've got your eye.
Yeah. Or that you're not a feminist. Like, it's this attitude of like, somehow you must be pretty pathetic if you want to get married and have kids. And it's like, guess what? There's no harder work out there. I had a baby a year ago, and I can tell you, I had some pretty strenuous work in Los Angeles that I was exhausted by half the time, and I was like, that was child's play. Now I'm actually really dealing with good work. But yeah.
All right, Jenny, we'll take one more.
You know what I found, following up on this? I've known a lot of couples who were shacking up that were like friends of my kids.
Mm-hmm.
My kids are in their 30s and late 20s. And I remember one girl in particular, her boyfriend was moving to LA, and should she go with him? I said, well, no, you're nuts if you go with him. You're not married, don't go.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I think he might ask me in February for Valentine's Day. And I've seen this more than once. They're living with the guy, but they want this sort of romantic, they want the big wedding. They want to wear the white dress and the veil. They've been living with the guy for years. They don't need a new toaster. They bought 3 already.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of women are very conflicted by all of this. On one hand, they want the romantic knight in shining armor to say, "Oh, darling, I can't live without you." But on the other hand, they're picking up his dirty underwear for 5 years.
Yeah, no, that's a really great way to put it. And good for you for saying don't do that, because there was a similar story of a woman I know whose niece she was in a long-term relationship with this guy, and they were buying a house together, but they weren't married and they didn't have anything on the books, and still nothing on the books. They've been married, they've been living in that house for almost 2 years. And that's the thing. It's telling people, like, you're being sold a bill of goods. My mom always says that. She's spoken a lot about building the family and also feminism and the damage of radical feminism. And it's like, feminism really is a bill of goods. I mean, you're being told you can have it all. And Lori Gottlieb, the woman we interviewed, wrote an article for The Atlantic about this idea that we can have it all. And she said, that is ridiculous. I mean, where does that apply in any other logic area of our life? Like, it would be like saying, I want to go to this birthday party, but I'm also scheduled to have a trip out of state, but I'm going to do both. And it's going to be on the same night. It's like, that, okay, are you going to bilocate? Like, but that's kind of how we're thinking. And we don't get that there are really big trade-offs. And there was a story that my mom actually put in her book called The Building the Family Cookbook. But it was that this woman went up to, I think it was Betty Friedan, who was like a major CEO at a company, and she was like, why didn't you tell us it was going to be like this? I don't even have a family. Like, I wasn't able to do it all. And then she said, well, we didn't know. But it's like, well, maybe they did know. I don't know. I mean, the founding feminists did not come from happy homes. They did not come from religious homes. They had serious issues with men. And we've got this major thing going in society that it's like tricked women to give away what's so valuable, which is actually being a woman. And it's like the woman has so much power. I mean, would civilization really have been built up the way it was if women hadn't been involved? I don't know. I mean, looking at my husband's apartment before we got married.
I mean, it's like versus our house now. I'd say that could be kind of a good analogy.
I mean, men have such amazing gifts. I mean, they fought the wars, they built the cities. I mean, but there has to be a heart beating behind that. Like, we're doing it for someone. Like, my husband and I were even talking about the movie Braveheart semi-recently. And we were saying it wouldn't have been the same if there hadn't been a romance in there. If William Wallace had just been like, well, gonna fight the British, or fight the English, like, without that kind of drama of the love he had lost and, like, that he was fighting for that gave the movie, that put the heart in Braveheart. And so that's what we have got to remember and, like, tell young people this, because the one other big thing we have going for us, or the one thing maybe we really have going for us, is the fact that this information is now novel. To hear that as a young person, it's almost like they're a blank slate and that nobody said that to them. So it's sort of this weird countercultural thought that might actually be like, you know what, that's actually true. And that's what we found with the dating project, like asking these questions, questioning the status quo, and saying, you know what, there is actually a difference between men and women. Like, that actually came up at a Thanksgiving gathering I was at. A woman who was kind of a grandmother age asked me, are there really differences between boys and girls? And I was like, yeah. But, like, I mean, she was a person who you would think would kind of have that knowledge in the bank. So it's like we've got to start saying these things again and questioning what's going on, because the dating project showed me that people are interested in that kind of thought. Like, they're interested to question because it's a new thought to them. It's that novelty factor. These old good values that aren't old in a bad way are actually really great for a lot of people to rediscover.
I think we'll stop with the questions now, but Catherine will be here.